Hello and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook, and with me is Karen Aram, who's commented especially on Asian matters for Aware on the Air. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, September 24th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Recordings of earlier programs and links to the articles we referred to today can be found on the Facebook page for Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at cgestabrook@gmail.com. Our program concentrates on the news of U.S. war making, which is generally not reported, not by accident, in the U.S. media. A fundamental axiom of U.S. foreign policy, going back more than a century to the open door policy of 1899 and before, is to prevent the economic integration of Eurasia under any political authority, local or foreign, for fear that that would interfere with the ability of the U.S. 1% to exploit Asia. That's what, after all, led to World War II in the Pacific. The great reversal came 70 years ago, after it seemed clear that the U.S. had established its world economic hegemony with the success of the Chinese Revolution. The success of that revolution and the destruction of American Asian policy led to the wars of the post-World War II years in Korea, in Vietnam, and Afghanistan, as the U.S. attempted to restore its control over the Eurasian economy. Our present concern with China, the so-called tariff war going on at the moment, has a long and important history, perhaps the most important history for recent American war making. Remember that modern jihadism, Islamic terrorism, which we have been frightened of for so long, was begun by the U.S. in an attempt to gather up the most fanatic Muslim fighters and send them into Afghanistan before the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in order to give Russia a Vietnam War of their own, in the words of President Carter's National Security Advisor. That's the situation we find ourselves in today, even though for most Americans that is ancient history that's forgotten. But the U.S. involvement with China is present history of the most important sort, and we want to talk about an aspect of that today with reference specifically to Chinese policy. You want to talk about this, Karen?
Well, I I like your coverage of the history, and that's where I really appreciate that you really do have a strong sense of history. In fact, that's what got me involved with Aware back in 2013, was hearing you comment on Obama's pivot to Asia, which I had been aghast at when I noted from some alternative source that we had set up a military base in Australia, because I thought, my God, that's got to be a provocation to China. But nobody was talking about it, and I was still at that time focused on mainstream media. I think adding Democracy Now!, considering it alternative, which now, anyway, shows how naive I was. But, and yes, I lived in China for 2 years in Shanghai. I lived and worked there. I spent 7 months in Hong Kong and 22 years in Bangkok, living within the Chinese Thai community. And my expertise with my job as an international recruiter for primarily international clients coming in to Thailand first, and then I worked the Asian Development Bank, and then later for the U.S. Firm in China. Bottom line is knowing and understanding the differences between Chinese culture and the indigenous cultures of the peoples in Southeast Asia. And that partly from having, my husband was of Chinese descent and lived within the, what I call the Chinese Thai community, which is not culturally, they're the old culture, though my husband was very much a supporter of Mao and the revolution, et cetera, et cetera. In any event, I want to get on to what's important here. That is why I did start getting involved with AWARE, and you convinced me to read Zbigniew Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard, which I think if anyone reads it, they can't help but see what the goals, and that was published in 1997, what the goals of U.S. hegemony and imperialism are. And they are Eurasia. And while Eastern Europe, of course, is extremely important, that's, I guess it's because it's the breadbasket, it's resources, etc. But most of all, it means containing Russia and China. But it also, I mean, China is the ultimate goal. Dissecting Russia and China's friendship, which actually Obama, with his pivot to Asia, actually cemented. And the Pentagon was not too happy about that, from what I read at the time. The goal is to control China, but it even goes back to the late 1800s, the early 1900s, Carl. I've discovered, I knew then that it's about their markets. They were always, the West was always interested in the Chinese markets. And China wouldn't allow West to put our products there because they could produce anything cheaper. And so that's one of the reasons that I heard recently that we then went and dumped opium on them. And that was the product that and it was the U.S. The Brits were doing opium primarily to India, as where the U.S. was doing it primarily to China. So, and I do recommend China Mirage. I can't remember the author's name right now, but that really gives you a good sense of history. And those who were actually profiting from our trade in opium at the time are some of those well-known families in the northeast of the United States, the Lowells and whatever. Anyway, back to what's happening today. One of the things that they've been doing, and we have this article from his pen name is Tony Cartolucci, but I've seen and read and heard other things as well. I just don't take notes. I'm not a scholar. I'm not an academic, so I absorb it, and then I can't find it to use as my references. But I could come up with
to other
Tony's.
people, believe me.
Yeah, well, I was able to come up with Tony Cartolucci's article, and like Mort Brussel made the point when he read it, I think it was yesterday, maybe it was the day before, I got lost here, was that when you read and this is to me what's most important, when you read the article, even if you question the author, or even if you question some of the details, if you really know what has been happening, if you know the history, if you look at what what our government has been doing over the years throughout the world, you can't help but see, I'm not using Mort's words, but basically the patterns involved. And Noam Chomsky has talked about this, Michael Parenti has talked about this, Chris Hedges has talked about this. You start to see what is happening. And I know we sound like conspiracy theorists when we talk about patterns, but it's true, it's real, and you realize that nothing is really any different today than it was 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And it's like when we were watching what took place with the ship in Iran, the Iranian ship in the waters here in the Persian Gulf area recently, we just looked at it and said, oh, Gulf of Tonkin, just like Vietnam. And then I think you even mentioned, oh, Spanish Main was, So when you really follow this and you really keep watching what's happening, it becomes so clear and precise. Unfortunately for the average person, and I was one of those before, while I was working and flying and traveling or raising my family, I wasn't watching and following it, even though politics had always been my major interest and I was living in Asia. So I do forgive the average American person who's clueless on what is happening and where our government is taking us. But that set aside, there are people out there who do focus on politics. And my problem is that too many people look only at elections, they look only at domestic issues, they are not focused on the cause. And so much of what is taking place here domestically is a result of foreign policy. Our foreign policy of imperialism and hegemony is what props up our capitalist system. So whether it's global warming, whether it's the problem with immigrants, they are all related to our system of capitalism. Now, you may not agree with me on that, Carl, but I think you do. But either way, I want to point out in the article, and I think you're better at paraphrasing the article that Tony has written about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. That's the north, I forget whether it's the northeast or the northwest, but
Northwest. Yeah.
northwest, thank you.
Sort of Oregon and Washington
Yeah.
comparison to
Right.
in the U.S.
It was at one time under the control of Turkey, but it's always been a part of China's geography. And so now they're under China rule. And when I was in China in 2001 on mission, I was communicating with some of the financial officers of the government in Beijing. And this was immediately after 9/11, actually. And something was said, and they pointed out that they were very concerned because they knew that there was unrest in that province, in that part of the world. But then I was taken to a restaurant that was owned and run by Uyghurs, and you could tell now they were mixed, Chinese and Turkish. It was quite obvious. And even when I lived in Shanghai in 2007, 2008, 2009, I went to a Uyghur restaurant, which was down the street every once in a while because I liked their food. And as I said, it was a combination of Chinese and Middle Eastern. So, and they have Uyghur restaurants all over China. So they're not all just up in Xinjiang province.
Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt you
That's
because
all
you're
right.
talking about serious things, but that reminds me of one thing that I heard about this. Apparently, Uyghur actors are in great demand in Beijing, in metropolitan China, because they look Western and speak perfect Mandarin.
There you go. That's probably that.
So they can be the villains, you know.
Yes,
They can
Perfect
play
villains.
these roles.
As
and
Western.
apparently,
Okay.
you've got a great future as a Uyghur actor in Beijing.
Well, they don't have, people don't understand Hong Kong. My daughters are Eurasian, and Thailand has many Eurasians, Bangkok, Vietnam, and Hong Kong has always had Eurasians. But they don't have that many in China, at least not when I was there. Of course, it's been 10 years since I was working there. In fact, when I mentioned Eurasian to some of the Chinese, they were kind of clueless. What is that? They see a picture of my daughter, and they didn't understand. They just saw her as a foreigner like me.
We should mention perhaps that her new book is here in front.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, speaking of my daughter, yeah, and she looks white, but she's half Chinese. But if she takes off her eye makeup, well, at any rate, yeah. And she covers the Middle East and Asia in her book here. Firm Denial, and this is a follow-up. Actually, it's Leisha Flynn is her pen name. It's a follow-up to her other novel, which is Firm Resolve. And I liked it. I don't read much fiction anymore, but I enjoyed it because I like the political intertwining and the fact that it's a mystery. And I also like the fact that she presents a view of the expat life so often, how they exclude themselves from the local communities when they're overseas.
We'll put references to these to this novel and its
Okay.
predecessor on the Facebook page for Aware
Thank
on the
you.
Air.
I didn't come on here to promote my daughter. I came on here actually.
Right.
I
It's
wrote
news.
Well, I wrote an article to the public eye related to an interview that I did. It wasn't really meant to be an interview. It was a conversation I had with my neighbor's niece. My neighbor is from China. She's elderly, and her niece was visiting. She was just there for a visit to her auntie while she is studying. She's a Chinese visiting scholar on Chinese scholarship in New York. And she came in and we were talking, and she's shy, okay, and I can tell. I lived in China. They're very fashionable in Shanghai and even up country, Hangzhou and places like that. Now, she's from Hangzhou. She is an IT specialist, but I could tell she's not coming from a well-to-do family. And our discussion was interesting because she was saying that she had a lot of complaints about her homeland. And she said that they have a high cost of living, high cost of health care, pharmaceuticals, education, housing, lack of jobs, low wages, impending labor problems. And I was the one who brought this up, with the implementation of artificial intelligence, which according to David Harvey, who is a scholar on communism, is that AI is going to have a huge impact on the labor in China. And so one of the challenges that the Chinese government is facing now is they're going to have to re-educate a lot of their people who have been working in factories working on very simple products, and train them in AI. Okay, now when she said all of that, I said, yeah, well, we have the same problems here. Everything, high cost of living, high cost of health care, pharmaceuticals, high cost of that, our high cost of education, high cost of housing, lack of jobs, low wages, everything that she was complaining about as a Chinese person who has she certainly has a right to complain about her government. I complain about mine. And she said that, yes, but you in the U.S. have the right to protest. You can pass out flyers, you can go online, TV, radio, and criticize your government, which we do, don't we, Carl? That's what we're here for. And I said, well, my understanding was that China also has a lot of protest. In fact, they have more protest almost daily than what we have in a year here. I'm not accurate on the data there, but I know they have many, many protests regularly. But she said, yes, but she said not against our government. She said we cannot protest against the Communist Party. So that, and she said if one becomes prominent criticizing their employers, they may be jailed. Well, then I pointed out, so same thing here, not our employers necessarily, but look at our whistleblowers. Look at Julian Assange. Look at Chelsea Manning. Look at, who else? John Kiriakou, Colleen Rowley, Snowden, yes.
Edward Snowden's new book, which we've just got here.
Right, right.
Describes
but there's so many others. There's so many others that we don't even know about. I mean, we had a young man who, just because he was giving water to people, immigrants coming in and dying in the desert, he was giving them water, he was arrested. And we have nuns in jail, I think. We have people who are, because they're protesting many of the things that are happening here in the U.S., they're either being, well, what is the Standing Rock? I mean, look what has happened to the people there. And look at the way the police treat protesters and people here. Okay, back to my point is that anything that she would complain about, while they have their argument, wow, we sure have ours here. And this is the kind of thing that I think we here domestically live in a little bubble, and that we don't really recognize what is taking place throughout our nation and what we're impacting upon other nations. And what we do see or hear about, we blame it all on the current administration. And while we may not like our current administration or leader, I certainly don't support him, what I think we need to recognize is that it's far more sinister than just a particular administration or a particular party in power. So let me go on about what she said then. She said, we have a lot of discontent in China due to the loss of jobs, primarily due to foreign investment leaving China for nations like Bangladesh, Thailand, etc., where the cost and wages are lower. And then I pointed out that, yes, we have the same problem here, a lot of discontent, because we lost jobs to China some years ago. So here again, we can compare that. Now, my point was that it's due to capitalism. So to her, the main problem in China is that things are deteriorating and many people blame the money going to development in Africa rather than to the Chinese people, especially those who were suffering recently from some of the huge floods they had. Now, my response was that, yeah, the problem here is our money going to military and weapons to kill people in other nations. She agreed. When I told her China should be defensive with U.S. battleships. We have our battleships in the, or warships.
Yes,
I think
good.
You told me to change that. I did change it. But like I said, I have so many of this article, so many revisions of whatnot that I miss out on these things. But yes, our warships. And that was done by Obama with his pivot to Asia in 2013, which, as I said, that's what brought me here. And that, I mean, that is a provocation to war. I mean, what would we do? What would the U.S. government do if China had their battleships, warships in the Gulf of Mexico or off the coast of California? So to show you how I know messed up my articles are is that I've now got something about the Patriot Act after 9/11, which has nothing to do with China. She also agreed when I made the point that looking at it geopolitically and long term, This is what we have to do. The BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, or formerly referred to as the Silk Road, the New Silk Road, with development elsewhere in the world by China, is positive long term. Because not only are they offering an alternative route through the Malacca Straits, which I've been talking about for some time, where all shipping and commerce must traverse in that part of the world. It also connects nations and peoples. It brings goods in half the time across Europe, Africa, and Asia, oil being a major product. It's a matter of survival from Western hegemony. Many people in the West forget, before the revolution, which as you were pointing out, Carl, China was occupied by Western nations with complete impunity, forcing opium upon their population. And that's a humiliation China won't forget. And it wasn't, as I said, it wasn't just the U.S. I mean, if you look at a map of pre-China, pre-Shanghai, you'll see that they had their territories, and Japan was one of them, the British, the French, and the U.S., and they were above the law. Chinese law couldn't touch them. And when you really go into it, it's really disturbing. Okay, so in spite of the devastation and poverty that China experienced before the revolution, and this is something that we need to emphasize, is that they have managed to reduce inequality and poverty of almost 800 million people, with improvements in infrastructure superior to most modern cities, with focus on providing alternative energy and the most modern transportation system in the world. They have also built modern cities and towns for the future. You know, we know that they have these huge cities and towns that they have built that are like ghost towns, and that the people, usually the elderly people, were forced out of their communities to have these towns built. Well, they don't want to go and live there because they want to stay with their family, their friends, and the cemeteries. This is very important to the Chinese, is because there is a lot of ancestor worship involved, and therefore they want to be close to the tombs of their ancestors. Now, but like David Harvey was the one who pointed out to me something that I should have recognized, it's for the future. They look always at the future, and that is what China is doing with their every 5-year planning, but in fact they've planned out 20, 30, 40 years in advance. This is something we don't do. I think we do when it comes to foreign policy, and I think we actually do when we do things like, oh, let's get rid of Social Security, and then there's a backlash, and everybody thinks, oh, how stupid our government is for doing that. But it keeps coming up under every president. And I didn't know it, but evidently Obama tried to do something to eliminate Social Security as well. Then I found that out just recently, too. So what I'm saying is that something that you've always pointed out, Carl, and both Michael Parenti and Noam Chomsky have also pointed out, is that our leaders in the U.S., no matter who they are not stupid, okay? They are not stupid. They know exactly what they're doing. Now, the president himself may be a puppet of the deep state, we'll call it. Such a simplistic term I don't particularly like. But bottom line, this is what's happening in the U.S. So in comparison, she had some minor complaints, such as she has to sign up, which just to buy a knife requires one to register. Well, I do the same to buy my allergy medicine. And here the proliferation of weapons, meaning guns and assault weapons, is responsible for so many deaths of children. I mean, our children aren't safe going to school anymore. In China, they don't have mass shootings or killings as the people don't have guns, okay? So every once in a while there will be somebody will go off and kill somebody with a knife, and on more than one occasion it has been a Uyghur, okay? And they would dress all in black and do something. So yes, they register buying a knife nowadays in China. So, and here our police have been militarized, okay? They are guilty of shooting and killing people, especially African American men, with impunity. Anybody who doesn't see that, I mean, it's horrendous, along with our mass incarcerations and the slave labor that is taking place. I mean, I heard that they're paying people, the mass incarcerated, 65 cents an hour. I mean, that's slave labor. I'm sorry. So Both nations suffer from media control. There's no question there. They have control of their media. We have control of our media. And maybe it's done differently. Here it's with propaganda. But basically we know most of our mainstream media is owned by our corporations that own our government. Now, in discussing Hong Kong, I pointed out the problem being its colonial past. See, all these protesters that are out there protesting. And yes, the U.S. is involved. Now, I want to make it very clear. The people are protesting not for the reasons that are given. They'll say that, oh, yes, we want democracy. What they want, and I know having lived there almost 20 years ago and watched how international companies were pulling out of Hong Kong and moving to Shanghai for the lower wages, the lower cost. Okay. Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is so expensive. And it's very, very small. Housing is so crowded. And when I was there, you had the mainlanders coming in and taking the jobs as immigrants, working for very low wages, working the jobs that the Hong Kong people, didn't want to do. It's always, that's usually the case, and being paid lower wages. And they were looked down upon. Well, today, the mainlanders are going back to Hong Kong and they're shopping. And they're shopping in all the luxury department stores and luxury goods stores. So now they're resented for being well off as opposed to having been poor. So many people in Hong Kong are suffering from great insecurity and economic insecurity in a city with as many as 93 billionaires. Get that, 93 billionaires in Hong Kong alone, second most of any city in the world. And I quote this from a Popular Resistance article. You can go to popularresistance.com. Kevin Zeese, Margaret Flowers wrote that. That's where they got the details, along with a couple of other people. But housing is incredible. I mean, they were living at one time, the people coming over were actually living in, they call them cages because they were basically cages. They were usually like off the balconies of some of the small apartments. So, and why is this happening? Because of all these billionaires, and most of these billionaires, like we know the name of one is Jimmy Lai. They compare him to Rupert Murdoch. They're real estate. So as soon as the handover took place, they immediately started profiting from the capitalist system of Hong Kong. So they are two separate territories. I mean, the SAR in China it's one, what do we call it? One state, one. I can't remember it now. I should remember this. I lived in Hong Kong. It was almost 20 years ago. But at any rate, the SAR, yeah. So bottom line, though, China doesn't really control Hong Kong. And China is not responsible for the conditions of economic inequality in Hong Kong. It's the Hong Kong elites, the Hong Kong billionaires, the Hong Kong profiteers that are responsible for what the Hong Kong people are suffering, all right? And then we have the NED, that's the National Endowment for Democracy. That's a major U.S. NGO, and they support many other NGOs like Freedom House, the CLB, that's the China Labor Bulletin. These are all funded by the CIA, okay? So they're there. They're not, I mean, they're inciting the riots. They're not totally responsible. And a young woman, she pointed out that she wishes the Chinese government would explain to the people in China what I was explaining about the economic inequality of Hong Kong. She said, they just keep telling us, oh, it's the Americans. Well, you have to understand that, just like we keep saying it's somebody else doing something. But basically, I think what we have to look at is that in Hong Kong, we're not just provoking the protest, but we're funding them. We have invested more than $500,000 beginning in 1996. But the CIA did through the NED. We don't know how much that is now. But U.S. interventions paved by false flags, as was done in the Ukraine, in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, etc., are what's taking place in Hong Kong, specifically focusing and targeting China. So basically what she was telling me is that they no longer have opportunities for upward mobility, at least from her perspective. She said it's a major problem. And I said, well, we have the same major problem here. Not everyone sees it, but it's growing rapidly in the U.S. as we have a huge problem with drug addiction. We have decaying towns and cities. And I recommend Chris Hedges' book on that. I think it's called The End of the American Empire. And then we have the homelessness here. We have crime. We have suicides, mass incarcerations, often for victimless crimes. So any complaints that anyone makes about China, we can pretty much counteract with it's even greater here. Now, I don't want to go overboard being positive about China. There are many people who do that, but I want to make it very, very clear that when we listen to the propaganda about China, when we criticize China, we're heading down the path of war, okay? We're heading down the path of further containment. And China, they will always turn a blind eye to violence, to instability. That is their culture, the old and present. And they'll keep on building at the same time. They just keep on building that BRI road and development throughout Africa. But when people complain about Africa, and you'll hear this, that's why I'm not really fond of Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera has some very good programs, but then they will also, when it comes to China, no, it's all negative, negative, negative. Bottom line, you have to leave it to the African people. If they're not happy that their governments are doing business with the with China's government, that's up to the African people. They're responsible for their governments. We're responsible for our government, and that's where I want people to focus. Now, the reason I'm reading this is because I wrote it and I sent it into the public eye, and they turned it down. Well, what surprised me was that they turned down something I considered to be of substance and necessary. When they had accepted an article from me last spring, which then ran all summer, and it was just a rant. It was a rant that I'd done on Facebook and submitted because I was tired of hearing people complaining about Trump, and I wanted to point out, yeah, Trump is awful, but so is Obama, and here's what Obama is responsible for. So I thought this had more substance to it, but I'll work on it. But bottom line, I want to make a point is that when she left, the young woman left, and I said that it's not up to the American government, just as it's not up to the American people to solve China's problems. It's up to us to solve our problems. And I see solving our problems, whether it's due to global warming or whether it's due to imperialism, is about changing our system. Because one needs to understand that in addition to destroying so many other nations, imperialism is cannibalizing our own. And that's where our focus needs to be. And I also pointed out that China does not, and to me this is the plus about China, they don't invade and destroy other nations. The last time they invaded another nation was Vietnam in 1979. They have one military base outside of China. They are building a second one, I believe, in Afghanistan, but they claim they're not really building it, that they're just financing it. They will not be operating it. But we have over 800 military bases outside of the U.S. Actually, its numbers are closer to 1,000. Right. And we have NATO surrounding Russia, and then we have all of these warships. Carl, how many warships do we have in the South China Sea? I'm not sure, but a lot of them are focusing on China.
Even the Navy knows.
Yeah. Anyway, we're not at war, and we are now at war in as many as 8 nations. That came about under the Obama administration. He took the Bush wars of 2 and increased them, and any kind of war with China will be absolutely devastating because they are nuclear armed just as we are. And they are our end game in our goal of control, and that's why I think it's very dangerous to go along and promote any propaganda against another nation where we are not responsible for what they do within their nation. We're responsible for what our nation does, which is the most horrendous.
Quite right. You're listening to Aware on the Air. Our task is to talk about the foreign policy, particularly the war policy and war provocations of the United States. And we're talking particularly today about China, which is substantially misrepresented in the American media, both China historically and the Chinese policy of the day. There is a great deal of time spent by American ideological institutions to convince people of the problems that China presents. The fundamental problem, of course, is not really mentioned, and that is the fact that China removes a good chunk of Eurasia, even more in conjunction with Russia, from exploitation by the United States. In order to mask the real concern of the American government in opposing the economic advancement of China, we have stories about what's going on in China and an attempt, as Karen pointed out, by the CIA to demonize the policies of China, which may well be open to criticism, but it's a criticism that should be based on a factual account rather than the sorts of things the U.S. has done in the midst of the greatest propaganda system the world has ever seen for generations, and to convince us that we are facing in various ways an international conspiracy of enemies that must be opposed, usually militarily. And for that reason, the U.S. has killed perhaps 20 million people in the years since the Second World War in order to advance the fortunes of American capitalism. This is a story that needs to be told better and needs to be told correctly, and there's a great deal of effort expended in the U.S. to make sure that Americans don't really know what's going on here. It would be a consummation of outly to be wished for us to become better informed about what our country is doing. The decisions of the country in terms of foreign policy are the decisions of the American elite, the American political establishment, and they often bear very little relation to reality. The task is to call things by their right names and to see what the U.S. has done, specifically the history of U.S. attempts to overthrow governments and societies that do not redound to the credit of to the profit of the U.S. elite, and that is a procedure which our media system goes out of its way to mask. The specific problem that concentrates our attention into China these days is the arguments about what China is doing with its Muslim minorities, specifically the Muslim minorities of the Uyghurs in the northwest version, the northwest area of China proper, the province of Xinjiang, we have been told recently that the Chinese are engaged in a mass suppression of this Islamic people, this Islamic minority within China. And there seems to be at least some truth in it, but whether the situation corresponds to the American media account or not is something we should be investigating rather than taking it at face value. Americans are very much involved with what's going on in Xinjiang, and the plight of the Muslim minority Uyghurs in that region. 6 months ago, in March of this year, Eric Prince, the head of Blackwater, whose name is probably familiar to you, signed a deal with China in the name of his new company, Frontier Services Group, to build a training camp in the northwestern Chinese region of Xinjiang, in the middle of the Uyghur region. What a clever title for a new company. Surely he must understand that the USA was second to none in both expanding and protecting its frontiers in its rise to #1 capitalist power in the world. Like Frederick Jackson Turner, Eric Prince understands the significance of the frontier in American history. It's a classic work of historical scholarship from almost a century ago by Frederick Jackson Turner. Turner wrote, "The appeal of the undiscovered is strong in America. For 3 centuries, the fundamental process in its history was the westward movement, the discovery and occupation of the vast free spaces of the continent." Free spaces. We are the first generation of Americans who can look back upon that era as an historic movement now coming to its end. That's Frederick Jackson Turner writing in the middle of the 20th century. It was coming to an end, but that has been a long drawn-out process, as the agonies of Trump's wall might indicate. That is, the process, the goals remain the same. Many people on the left, especially those with a fuzzy ideal of socialism, which remarkably enough we're talking about again in this country, welcome China's rise as a new hegemon, since anything opposed to the USA has to be backed, even if it involves putting Uyghurs into concentration camps, hiring Eric Prince to make sure that those out of prison mind their P's and Q's, and cozying up to Saudi Arabia. Now, that is clearly a debate on the left in America, but a debate that depends upon an accurate account of what's really being done. The praise or blame of China depends upon an accurate account of what the Chinese government is doing and why, and that's not what we get from the American media, which, remember, is probably the most sophisticated propaganda system that has ever been invented, and that the U.S. argument has to begin with a penetration of that system and an attempt to call things by their right names, to describe accurately what's going on in China. That's what Karen has been trying to do here, and it's not an easy task, being totally, quote, pro-China or totally anti-China doesn't accomplish a thing, and finally supports in one way or another the American attempt to give its own account of what's going on in the world in regard to the great contest with Asia that has defined American politics literally for generations. There's much to be done here, and the prospects are not propitious. The job is very big, and the stakes are very high. Take just one example. I want to come back to Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, but there is another example that Karen just mentioned that I think Americans should know more about. I asked various friends of mine if they've ever heard of the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'm shocked about the number of sophisticated people who have no idea what I'm talking about. The most they can do is suggest I have no idea what I'm talking about, and far too many people believe that anyhow. But in the case of the Belt and Road Initiative, I have some evidence. The Belt and Road Initiative refers to a program or a series of programs that China has been following for a while to increase the connections, the economic connections between China and the rest of the world. The Belt is the seaborne commerce that Karen mentioned a moment ago, particularly its importance in the Malacca Straits and the exit to the rest of the world of most Chinese commerce. And
all
the road.
Chinese, all Chinese commerce, all ships must go through the Malacca Straits.
And the road refers to the overland connections,
Yes.
which China has to the rest of the world. The Belt and Road Initiative that China is working on is a series of activities and investments designed to increase the connection between China and the rest of the world along these lines. Now, you would think that if the U.S. really meant what it said about increasing economic expansion around the world, the first thing it would do would be to cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative and try to look at other forms of economic connection, given specifically the vast growth in U.S. and Chinese economic connections over the last generation. In fact, what the U.S. has done is to do what the U.S. does is to do whatever it can to stifle the attempt to establish these economic connections around the world. The U.S. goes to China and supports military regimes. China goes to Africa and builds. Sorry, let's try that again. The U.S. goes to Africa and supports military regimes. China goes to Africa and tries to establish these economic connections. That's a fundamental imbalance, and American government policy is threatened more and more by the Belt and Road Initiative and the economic expansion that China is promoting. Donald Trump gave a speech at the UN this morning, and as I say, it was just a short while before we recorded, and I've heard only a little bit of it, but one of his themes was an attack on globalism. Now, there's a word that's worth examining simply because it's used for a variety of things, and there's not much agreement on what globalism is, except in the words of the President of the United States, it's bad and therefore should be attacked. There's a lot buried in this. Let me try to suggest one stratum that we might come to if we try to excavate it. Globalism, in one of its meanings, refers to the neoliberal and neoconservative policy, or the result of the neoliberal and neoconservative policies of the United States that establishes a hegemony of American capitalism in the rest of the world. Globalism is an organization of the worldwide economy by and for the benefit of the American 1%. Now, under that description, President Trump became president by attacking it. He became president because Americans who had suffered for years under the reduction of economic flourishing that followed the Second World War found themselves confronted with a worldwide economic policy that concentrated wealth in fewer and fewer hands and suppressed expansions of wages in the United States. Wages in the U.S. have been essentially flat for 40 years, and in that same 40 years, the concentration of wealth has not only grown immensely, but accelerated throughout that period, so that we now have a concentration of wealth in the United States that's close to what it was, and maybe worse than what it was, on the eve of the Great Depression at the time of the stock market crash in 1929. This is the result of 40 years of neoliberalism, and which is globalism by another name, 40 years of neoliberalism by all American administrations, Republican and Democrat alike. Although it was not much commented upon at the time, the real appeal of Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential campaign was that he was understood as attacking the economic regime that to many Americans seemed to have deprived them of the economic possibilities that their parents' generation had had. That's what people voted for. After voting for hope and change with Obama, they suddenly found, not very suddenly, they concluded that the failure of hope and change meant that Trump's criticism should be listened to. Now, in fact, those charges were so serious that the response from the Democrats could not be direct. They could not deny that wages were flat and that wealth had concentrated remarkably at an accelerating rate in the period of the previous administrations. So what they did was say, well, look, Trump's criticisms are really a matter of racism. The deplorable people, as Mrs. Clinton said, are attacking the attempts of the Democrats to overcome racism and other forms of discrimination, groups that have been excluded from the American prosperity. There was a germ of truth in that, but only a germ. What they really heard, what Americans really heard, was a defense of the very system that has so dashed their hopes in the previous administrations. Now, given that, there was a tremendous effort by when Trump was inaugurated to make sure that his administration did not act on any of these criticisms. The American political establishment went mad in a way, and I grew up in the McCarthyist era. They went mad in a way no one had seen in a while. That's what the nonsense about Russiagate was about, to make sure that those criticisms from Donald Trump were not acted upon. And Donald Trump obliged. He did not, for the most part, act on those criticisms. The pressure not to do so was very great from the American political establishment, and it essentially succeeded. So that the policies of the Trump administration were those same neoliberal and neoconservative policies that had characterized the previous administration. But the attacks went on. Trump continues to say globalism is the enemy, and there's just enough truth in that people listen to it. So leaves the administration in a somewhat contradictory position, but they have to follow the neoliberal policies while they are criticizing them. And indeed, we heard more criticism today of those policies under the name of globalism announced by the president at the United Nations. So the jury's out. The jury is the American people here, and the question is, can they be misled completely on what the American government is doing and whose interests are being served by the policies of all administrations up to and including the present one? Cui bono. We should be talking about that. But when we criticize globalism, we also understand that the American foreign policy is not separate from the American domestic economic policy that's having the effects that are so disturbing the American people. And the basis for the defense of these policies are frequently the challenges that America faces around the world, notably from China and Russia. And the American response, the American foreign policy response, has been quite a vicious set of color revolutions, as Karen described, over 2 generations now. So domestic policies and foreign policies are bound up here together, and the center of both, interestingly enough, we find China. And what Americans believe about China is extremely important to the maintenance of American economic hegemony, of the American elites' hegemony in the American economy and in the world economy as well. So, and the old SDS motto, everything is connected, but it's worthwhile to trace these connections, because obfuscating them is the primary task of the world's greatest propaganda system. You're listening to Aware on the Air. Our task is to try to talk about the war making of the United States and the ideology behind it, the attempt to mislead Americans about what is really going on. We've been talking specifically about China today. We have a few minutes left. Do you want to continue on that, Karen?
Yes, a couple things. When you were talking about Trump talking about globalism or globalization, I'm reminded of what took place in at the Seattle World Conference, and I'm thinking, I never put, Trump as aligned with the activists, the protesters and activists who were in Seattle protesting against globalization. But you're right, he did say all the right things as a candidate, but and
Some right things.
oh God, yes. And then I don't pay attention. I got rid of TV. I don't listen to anything that's mainstream media because I was so disgusted by it when I first came back here. So when Trump was actually running for office, I honestly didn't hear anything he had to say. And so bottom line, it's only now that I'm hearing from other people the comments that he made that would have really irritated me at him at the time. But I've tried to just blank it out. But support him, no, never. I honestly, my attitude is that anyone running for either of our two parties, the Republican or the Democrat Party, now I'm not talking about on a local level, but I'm talking once they get behind the Beltway, okay, they are owned lock, stock, and barrel by the corporations. And I like to quote our friend David Johnson from the Labor Hour, who made the point that the minute the candidate takes that first corporate check for his fund during his fundraising, he knows who owns him. And that's exactly what happens. They're not ignorant, they're not innocent. They know when they become president that they're going to have to carry out much of what their corporate handlers or their CIA handlers or whatever expect them to do. But something I want to point out, getting back to the Uyghur situation, that on this Tony Cartalucci's article, he does make the point that, and this is what, to me, just watching any of it without having anybody even discuss it was pretty obvious, is that this organization in D.C., they're set up in D.C. The U.S. State Department, by way of the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, has an office in D.C. for the World Uyghur Congress, which is the one that, and they are funded by the State Department, just as we funded the Dalai Lama back during the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. We still pay him, but we funded his office, and we funded a lot of the terrorism that was taking place against China. And it was actually Kissinger. One good deed he did was that when the CIA approached Kissinger for a lot more money, he said, well, what have been the results of funding the Dalai Lama's war against China? And they had to admit that there was nothing. There was nothing good, only a lot of dead Chinese and a lot of dead Tibetans and some bloody suitcases. So Kissinger cut off that, but they continue to fund the Dalai Lama's office in D.C., and he has a home in India, of course, but I just want to point that out. But so this is typical. This is what we do, and this is what you were referring to about us funding these organizations and the resistance to whatever government is in power in whatever nation we are looking to take down. The last point I think that I want to make, though, is to mention the moderate rebels or the Gray Zone Project, is Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton. These are two young award-winning journalists. Now, they have specialized on uncloaking a lot of what has taken place in Palestine by the Israelis, and Max's book Goliath covers that very well. And they're very focused on Latin America. So they did two podcasts related to China and what is taking place primarily in Hong Kong. But because they admitted that they are weak on China, I mean, nobody can be strong on everything unless they are Noam Chomsky, Chris Hedges, or Michael Parenti. But they had his name is Carl Zhao, I've forgotten, and I will trust that they chose him to speak on behalf of what was happening in Hong Kong. And this was about 2 weeks ago, I think. And one thing that did come up in relation to the Uyghurs was that the camps in Xinjiang, the camps have been closed down. So that I just want to point out, these camps. But again, like it's been pointed out, the numbers are vague. There has never been anything like a million, and that they just pull these out of the air. So there's no transcript that I can send to you, Carl, because I don't know if you like to read it. You have to listen to the podcast. But as I said, there are so many really reputable people out there, journalists, who are covering what is taking place, and that's where we have to really get our our information.
We'll put some links to that on the Facebook page
let's do
for
that.
Aware on the Air.
Okay, good. Thank
which
you.
you have been watching, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Andrew Scalray. Thanks to him, also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Comments on this program are welcome. Email me at cgestabrook@gmail.com. Thanks to Karen today, and we rely on our researcher Jeff Nicholson, whose blog Digital Citizen we recommend highly. We steal from it regularly. There's a link to it on our Facebook page too, along with his detailed notes to this program. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others. Snowden's new book is here on the table, who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government, and particularly our liberal Democratic Senator Durbin, a shill for the Russiagate propaganda and unconstitutional attacks on the free press, notably in the case of WikiLeaks. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for the members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.